Everybody, welcome back to class. Here we are to wrap up basically all of World War II, but specifically defeating Japan in the final couple battles and end of the war in the Pacific Theater. So this was the intro slide I had for you yesterday. If you didn't get the chunk on Iwo Jima, which I want to kind of cover these final battles chronologically, like meaning in order, you should go back and watch the lecture notes on Iwo Jima first. But basically, next stop, the next island we hopped to after the Battle of Iwo Jima was Okinawa. Now, this is another island that, why isn't it going? There we go. This is another battle that takes place on Japanese soil. So, like I had said in the last chunk, most of the Japanese empire it's a territorial empire of a bunch of islands out in the Pacific. We've taken away quite a few of the islands that they had conquered at this point. Most of those they've lost. Now we're starting to move in on the Japanese homeland and Japanese soil. Now, you're not going to go and attack the main Japanese islands. So, like looking up here is Honshu. I forget some of the other names of the main Japanese islands. But here, this my cursor's at right now are the four big islands. Okay, then there are tons of little islands up here. This is where Iwo Jima is, so pretty close to Japan. Okinawa is even closer. That's the next stop that we're taking. Now, I'd said in the last chunk, Iwo Jima is a tiny, tiny little island, about 5 miles by 2.5 miles. Okinawa is bigger. I don't have the exact stats on it, but it's many, many times larger than Iwo Jima. But still, but when you look at a map of the Pacific Ocean, it's still really, really tiny. That you'd have a hard time finding it on a map of the whole ocean. You kind of see it in there a little bit, like a little speck of dust right there. But that's where Okinawa is, and it's just south of the main islands of Japan. So the plan was now. Remember, nobody knows that America has developed atomic bombs at this point when the Battle of Okinawa is playing out. Only the top like head ups in the American and British government understand that has been playing out behind the scenes. So we still think your average American soldier, your average American, back on the home front, we still think we're going to have to defeat Japan the old-fashioned way, just like we did with Nazi Germany. And the next stop was going to be, I forget exactly where, but they were zeroing in on a possible topics, but we were going to go in and invade the main Japanese islands next, one of the four big islands. Now, I think basically what Okinawa is and the fighting that plays out there, it's a taste of things to come. Had we not used the atomic bombs, the fighting to take Japan was going to be horrifically bloody because they don't surrender. They fight to the last man. Even if they're out of bullets and stuff, they're still going to be popping out of nowhere trying to stab you and do whatever they can to inhibit and stop the invading army. That's what we see at Okinawa. So Okinawa, the scale of fighting taking place there is essentially a lot like the fighting at Iwo Jima, except it's on a bigger scale. There are more Japanese soldiers. It's a bigger island. Very, very tense fighting. It takes us a couple months to lock down this tiny little island, and it ends up becoming, for the Pacific theater of the war, it's the bloodiest battle America fights in. So again, very similar, a lot of similarities to the Iwo Jima battle and this one. It's just on a bigger scale, bigger island, more soldiers involved, higher casualty rates. Anyway, is traditionally part of Japan. If you go to Okinawa today, I guess it's a very beautiful little island. I mean, it's the battlefields and it's not all tore up today and bombed out. It's recovered quite nicely, and it actually is a pretty big tourist destination. Actually, one of my former students that graduated a couple years ago joined the Marine Corps, and he's stationed in Okinawa today, and said he loves it over there. People are pretty friendly. It's a cool base. It's kind of warm, tropical. So I guess it's a pretty nice place to visit if you ever go to that part of the world. It would be high on my list of places to see for the historic value of it and just for the cultural value, and because it sounds like a pretty cool, nice little island. Anyway, things that I want you to also have in your notes here, a couple key terms. And I've mentioned this stuff before, but this is stuff worth putting in your notes. When I talk about how the Japanese don't surrender and they have that honor mindset, and how they fight so differently from the Germans, and this really boggles the mind of American commanders and average American GIs that are out there fighting. We can't understand. They're in a hopeless situation. why don't they just surrender? We're not really like evil. We're not going to go eat their babies and rape their women. And you know what I mean? Like they've been told, just like all the countries of World War II used propaganda, the Japanese have been told for years that these Americans are just, we're the devil. You know what I mean? They think, and this is what their leadership has told them, that we are just horrible, savage barbarians. They're going to eat all their children and rape their women. And like literally, I think a lot of them thought that that's what they were expecting from the American army. And it's the honor culture. So whether they believe that or not, if they were told to fight to the last man, they likely would have done that. Your average Japanese soldier would have. So specifically here, a term I'd want you to have is bonsai charge. You may have heard of like a bonsai tree. Anyway, a bonsai charge is a very different thing from a little decorative tree that you might buy at Meijer. A bonsai charge is essentially, think of it as a suicide charge, where it's like, we're out of ammo. The Americans have us surrounded. Where most of our guys are dead. Any other army at this point would likely surrender, but the commanding officer there of this unit of Japanese soldiers says, "All right, it's time to, preserve our honor. You die an honorable death. Lock your bayonets in. Go get them fixed on, and we're all just going to go together and charge the American lines." And these guys, typically, most bonsai charges, some of them. Didn't really do anything to the Americans because these guys got mowed down by machine guns before they could ever get to the American lines. But other times there was enough of them where they catch us off guard that before the American soldiers with better equipment, more bullets and all that can shoot and kill all of these guys, they pop out and they take a handful of American guys with them. They also might use explosives or grenades, whatever they could. Anything that they had, bamboo poles sometimes that have been sharpened up, they'll use anything they can to go try to take out as many American invaders as possible to give their death more honor and meaning. Next up, everybody's heard of this term before, I would think, but a kamikaze is how you pronounce it. A kamikaze is kind of the same thing as a suicide charge, but with a plane. Now, a big misconception, and a lot of kids, I don't think, totally understand this about World War II when they come into my class. Back in the beginning of the war, when you go back to like the Pearl Harbor attack or the Battle of Midway, Japanese were not using kamikazes back then. It was a waste of resources and the waste of a good pilot. It's not like they all want to die. It's just that they would rather die and have an honorable death than have to be defeated and have the dishonor of being a POW and surrendering and losing. So they don't start using kamikaze planes until the very end, the kind of the last year of the war, when things become hopeless and they realize they've lost and America is going to come in and try to get an unconditional surrender and invade their homeland. By that point, they're desperate enough that they sometimes have to order pilots to do this, but often they would just get volunteers. And these pilots were willing to do this, where they would take a plane, they'd only put enough fuel on it for it to do a one-way trip to either hit a boat or any really, when I say boat, I mean like a ship, an aircraft carrier, or any other American like military strategic target. They'd put just enough fuel in it for a one-way trip to whatever they were going to get. They would take as many bombs and explosives as they could. And that pilot's mission is you go crash that and cause as much damage as you can. Obviously, the pilot dies in the explosion, but think of the trade-off there. If you're willing to sacrifice one fighter plane and one pilot, sometimes you could do major damage and take a whole aircraft carrier or battleship out of the fight. You're probably not going to sink it that way, but they can take, you'd crash it into the bridge of the ship. That aircraft carrier is out of commission and isn't going to be used for a while. It'll take quite a while, probably months to get it repaired and back in the fighting. So when you think of it that way, the trade-off, one man, one pilot for a ship with several thousand guys on it and lots of planes, it's strategically, I guess, kind of a smart move. So anyway, that's what a kamikaze is, a suicide plane where they go in and crash them. Last term I have for you that's a Japanese word, and I'm not sure that I pronounced this perfectly, but it's seppuku. This is now like Japan has a kind of caste system and hierarchy where you had like the old samurai class, the warriors, the kind of upper crust, like almost nobility, think of them that way. The guys that are the officers that are leading units of men. Typically, they would not do a kamikaze charge or a bonsai charge or a kamikaze flight. that was seen as kind of like beneath them. Your average soldier, the privates and corporals, the low ranking guys, they would go and do these suicide missions, how I just described. But the officers typically wouldn't do that because, I don't know, it's just a cultural thing where they were kind of above them and of a different level in society. But it's not that they were cowards. It wasn't that they were just going to say, all my men can go die and then I'm going to surrender. It would have been horribly dishonorable, like the most dishonorable thing you could think of, to have all of your men go die and then for a commanding officer to surrender. So basically, none of these Japanese officers or the head ups, commanders, surrender either. But often what they would do is seppuku, which is a ritual suicide. So after all their men have done a banzai charge, or they're done and the battle's over and they're about to, before they get captured, they're going to take their best man, their like lieutenant, their brother. Think of it almost like your best man in your wedding, but this is a much darker thing. And remember how we talked about them using samurai swords, and they would often execute prisoners and POWs with those. You don't really use samurai swords on the battlefield anymore in modern wars, but they still kept them as a cultural thing, and they look cool, and they, as part of their uniform. Well, this is where the samurai sword would get some action, and you would essentially, to check this out, how intense these guys are, and how deep this honor culture runs. You would basically kind of meditate, get your mind right. You're going to die here. Whoever is committing seppuku, the colonel or the captain or general or whatever the case may be, is going to get down on his knees. He's going to be in kind of like a white robe and no shirt on underneath. He's going to split his shirt open, and then very calmly and without saying anything. This is a key part of it. To have an honorable death, you cannot scream out in pain. You don't want to even show emotion on your face. You're going to take a small dagger, like a little katana blade, and they would take that and jam it into their stomach and then slide it right across their belly, and it'll spill their guts. How about that? And you're supposed to do it just straight faced. You don't say anything. Now, if you know anything about injuries like that, that's not a quick death. You get your belly cut open or take a bullet in your belly or something. That's a really painful injury that burns, and often it might kill you, but it's going to take hours and hours. It could take hours literally to bleed out from an injury like that. So then if you've done all of that right, and you've achieved honor, and you've spilled your guts, like literally, then the guy that is you kind of like your right hand man would be standing beside you. And once you've done all that, you're going to be in pain, kind of bent over, and he would take, and you want this guy to be somebody that's trustworthy, that's used the sword before. He would ideally take one slice with the samurai sword and chop your head off, and that ends your suffering. And that was like an honorable death. So anyway, when I talk about the cultural differences between Germany, Russia, Great Britain, France, America, all the European countries, and Japan, know that I've never heard of any European officers doing anything like that. And as we start seeing more and more of this, and our soldiers are exposed to it, it's mind blowing. Our guys can't figure out why the heck are they why are they like this? But it's a cultural difference that's programmed into you from the time you're a kid on. And there is a huge disconnect between your average American soldier and your average Japanese soldier. So anyway, about this fighting and what they're seeing here at Okinawa, this is a taste of things to come, except it was going to be 10 times worse, 100 times worse once we get to the main Japanese islands. So this makes us a little bit nervous and a little bit reluctant to go and invade those islands. But at the same time, we're 100% committed that the only kind of surrender we will accept from Japan is an unconditional surrender. That basically, that just means we've won, you've lost, we can do whatever we want to you. Japan at this point was trying to negotiate. They wanted to say, well, how about we move our troops out of China and Korea and we lose all our island, but they were still trying to negotiate a surrender. But for actually a couple years up to this point, Great Britain and America had decided that all we will take is an unconditional surrender from Japan. So we're in this thing to the bloody end. All right. Next chunk of notes, we'll wrap it all up and talk about how the war finally ends. Take care.